Hi, this is Paul. I was going to have a new video for you this morning on Monday, but Friday afternoon when I was recording the video that was going to happen on Monday, the power went out and it stayed out. And files got a little messed up, as sometimes happens when you're recording the way I do. So that video is lost. And it's interesting. I have 2 weeks in a row where I have videos that, for one reason or another, have been technologically lost to the world. But, well, that's sort of the way it goes. The video was started out with this conversation that a lot of people pointed me to with Elizabeth Oldfield, Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor, former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and Philip Goff, hosted by... I thought he really shone in this. He had a conversation with Peterson not too long ago. Where's his name? I had a problem with names lately. It was at the Royal Institution, and it was... Oh, come on. Anyway, it'll come up at some point, but I thought he did an excellent job with this group. And there's a lot that one could say about this. This conversation has fascinated some people and annoyed some other people. But let's get into it.
Big question right away. What's the point of us existing?
In 3 minutes and not more. As a Christian, my starting point is that we exist because the most fundamental form of activity, energy, call it what you like, that is there is love. That is, it's a willingness that the other should be. The world exists because God desires there be an other. And so love is fundamental to that. And so our point in being here is to receive that, to realize it step by step, day by day, to grow into what is possible.
Now, I know some people find Rowan Williams squishy. I'm going to make a case that this actually is a very good, broad answer. The chief end of man is to love God and enjoy him forever is, of course, the Westminster first question and answer of the Westminster Shorter Confession. And Rowan Williams basically, I remember when we had the Jonathan Peugeot, John Vervaeke, Jordan Hall conversation, towards the end of that, basically, again, Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Hall basically talked about love and wanting, and God knowing us, God wanting us, God desiring something for us. We had an excellent Sunday estuary here at church, and we had a visitor who came completely not knowing me at all. It was great. He came in, and usually when people come in and I don't recognize them at all, it's usually because they've seen me on YouTube and they're passing through Sacramento and they've come to the church and they want to meet me and they want to see what's going on. Well, this guy comes in, and he comes in and he says, "Is this where the thing is?" Because he wasn't quite sure what thing it was that he was coming to. I said, yeah, it's in here. It was the first one that got here. And he didn't have that look on his face like he knew me. So I said, "I'm Paul. What's your name?" And he told me his name. And then he came in and sat down. And I said, "Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?" Which is a question that all of you have heard quite a bit. And he said, "Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?" I thought, okay, fair enough. He knows nothing about YouTube or anything. He just came because of the meetup.com thing, which I was on the fence about canceling that because it's crazy expensive for what it's worth, quite frankly. So then I began to talk to him about these things, and then we went around in our estuary circle, and he basically said, much to the delight of a couple of the church people that were there, he basically said, what's with this relationship with God thing? And a couple of the other topics were also very interesting, but a lot of people kind of cued in on that topic too, wanting to talk about that. Because, and one of the things that I came to is just the fundamental nature of relationality. when we are born, we have no, especially in terms of our agency, when we are born, we have very little capacity to relate. And so what our parents basically pour into us is bit by bit giving us first by sort of mirroring them, bit by bit, we learn how to relate to one another. And that's why having not a broken family, but a relational family. On one of the live streams, on Luke's live stream, the conversation wound into the area of divorce. And I found that to be quite a powerful conversation for everyone. A number of people on the Hollywood Squares had been divorced and talked about it and talked about its pain, as compared to, let's say, the pain of death. Many will state that divorce is more traumatic and painful than death. Losing a spouse to divorce is more traumatic than losing a spouse to death for many people. But so we talked in our group about relationality, and one of the things that I said is that I think one of the chief dichotomies that I see in the world, and of course it's not always conscious, are those who say that the world is basically impersonal and human beings and maybe a few others are the only agents in it, or that in fact the world is fundamentally relational. And it's been interesting watching the conversation move towards that. And so basically Rowan Williams' answer to the question, you could have said, is the world a product of accident or intention? And implicit in Rowan Williams' answer is intention. And what was so interesting about this entire conversation is nobody really wanted to lean hard in terms of making the case that the world is accidental. That in fact, well, the conversation sort of wound up boiling down to, is the world the product of good intention? Is the world product of competent intentionality? Or has something gone terribly wrong, and that terribly wrongness we can pin on the author of this world?
For us, with all the help we can get, frankly. That means two things, which I think perhaps need saying when we're talking about faith and whatever faith isn't. First, it's not as though God is a kind of extra item in the universe who might or might not be there. God is as present in the universe as Bach is in the St. Matthew Passion.
Okay. So with the development of conversations, I think good faith conversations between atheists and theists, let's say, the point that Rowan Williams has made is almost a point that in many cases doesn't even need to be made anymore, at least at a certain level of the conversation. These things always sort of have a trickle-down effect. A lot of these things don't trickle down, but this gets into God is not a super thing in the sky, all of these kinds of things. The relationship between a symphony and Bach, the relationship between Middle-earth and Tolkien. Now, and again, in our estuary group, we talked about relationality, and I made these analogies for the group because the person who came off cold, came in cold, he didn't give me a lot to work on as a pastor, and pastors are always trying to work on cold reads. There's this great scene in Leap of Faith, a wonderful Steve Martin movie from the 90s, where Steve Martin is trying to cold read people. Pastors are always trying to cold read people because it just sort of speeds up the interaction, because I sort of want to know where you're coming from, because I have this whole menu of approaches that I will take depending on where you're coming from. And if you don't give me any indication of where you're coming from, I have to sort of shoot blindly. And so then I sort of switch to another frame where I'm asking open-ended things so that you disclose yourself a little bit, say, oh, okay, I'd like to find you somewhere so we can actually have a productive conversation. So this point that God is not a super thing in the sky, now this completely shifts the conversation. And what I liked about this conversation here is that it gets shifted. Now, I think a lot of Christians get really excited that, okay, we've landed the point that Bilbo cannot find Tolkien in Middle-earth, even though Tolkien is throughout Middle-earth. But then the question of the person coming into Estuary was, how am I supposed to relate to Tolkien if Tolkien is present in Middle-earth the way Tolkien is present in Middle-earth? And we also talked in our group about the fact that, in my experience, most people who give up believing in God, or give up going to church, or give up practicing religious or Christian practices, they usually switch over to trying to relate to universe. And, for a long time I had the Verizon lady from that ad way back in the late 90s, early aughts, where this woman is going to a Verizon store and she's talking to the universe. And I forget what I called her. I'm sure I could dig her up out of my archives. But that's, in my experience, what most people do, as now should be abundantly clear, except to atheists who are absolutely recalcitrant. Most people, the science is clear. The God science says pretty clearly that when most people become atheists or give up on organized formal religions, they sort of pick up folk religions and other beliefs, and they talk to the universe and all this kind of thing. That tends to be what they do. So, in other words, God number one, because that's roughly what we're talking about there, Tolkien to Middle-earth is sort of like God number one. Well, he's present everywhere in Middle-earth. Dorothy Sayers, of course, writes herself into the story. She writes herself in because she wants to have a relationship with the characters in her story. Now, she writes herself into the story in a particular way where she's not actually Dorothy Sayers, the author. And I forget the title of it. There's a couple of movies that sort of play with these themes a little bit. But, so what's interesting again is that sort of God number oneness is back on the stage. And again, I first saw the God number one, God number two thing was when I was watching Jordan Peterson talk to Sam Harris. I think many atheists have moved on from arguing about the super thing in the sky, and now really what they are making arguments about, which is what I think all of the arguments have been about, is to what degree can whatever this thing that authored this universe, to what degree is God reliable? To what degree is God relational and relatable? Can he be sought after? And is there any point to seeking after him? Now, in the Estuary group, I made the point that it is an asymmetrical relationship with God. It is not sort of like talking to another adult. It is much more like, let's say, an infant trying to figure out how to relate to a parent. The parent has so much more going on, but of course, with God, the delta is even larger. But of course, via Christianity, and I think other religions probably to some degree too, the delta is crossed by God. John Calvin, you would use the word condescension. God condescends. It's a word I grew up with Reformed dogmatics. God condescends, just like the mother condescends to agapically pour herself into that child to grow that child up. So again, in the 7 years we've been watching this stuff, we're no longer sort of having to sit around and, Sam Harris is sort of kneecapping a super thing in the sky. And at this point, many theists, or at least participating in this level of conversation, can sort of at the front say, hey, look, let me tell you what I believe in God. Now, that's God number one. God number two is, of course, Dorothy Sayers writing herself into the story. Tolkien would, let's say, if he entered into the story somehow, and of course that's what the incarnation is, with Jesus entering the story. Now God, the God of Israel, obviously entered the story in some interesting ways in the Old Testament. You can You can argue whether or not that's the angel of the Lord and the relationship with a pre-existing Christ, yada, 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 yada. There's all those kinds of things about. Again, my point is that just because the playing field has shifted doesn't mean that Christians are going to get all what they want. Because the truth is that the strangeness that we've had temporarily of the playing field, where people were sort of skeptical of the super thing in the sky, and Christians, partly because what happened in evangelicalism in the mid-20th century was a shift towards God number two. Again, my favorite takeaway example of this is a paraphrase from Chuck Colson's book, Born Again, when Chuck Colson basically, he's going through some terrible stuff because the Nixon White House is falling apart, and he knows he's going to do time for this, and he goes, but he's been evangelized by a group of people in Washington, D.C., and he now is in a personal relationship with a living God, and he comes home and declares to his wife, "I'm a Christian." And she's like, "I thought we were Episcopalian." And so in some ways, a certain degree of Christian nominalism is sort of all a vague God number one and not very much relationality with God number two. Evangelicalism became deeply relational with God number two, to the point that, again, in the 70s and 80s, Christians were running around saying, Christianity isn't a religion, it's a relationship. So all of these things going on. So again, we're seeing these big shifts. I got to grab the two books that I pointed out when I was... Justin Brierley is right. It's just right. But it's not... I think a lot of Christians read Justin and say, oh, good, they're all going to be flocking back to church. And I have to say, oh, no, they won't. Because there's a bigger transition underway, and that transition's going to hit the church, and that transition is hitting churches. And there's going to be some adaptation going on. The second book I want to point out is Spencer Klavin's book, and I might play a little bit. He had a conversation with Marcus at More Christ, and, oops, holding it upside down. I am really enjoying this book. Now, Spencer gave me a copy, and he signed it, which I hoped he would, and he signed it for Paul, the internet's pastor. And I was just really touched by this. But the truth is that I do a lot of reading via audiobooks, and Spencer reads the audiobook, and he's such a good reader, and he has such a beautiful voice. That guy could read audiobooks for a living because he is so good at it. And him doing his own book, it's really good. I am really enjoying the audiobook of this, even though I have the hardcover. Thank you, Spencer. And Spencer and I are going to have a conversation about his book, and I think his book is great. I think his book is really nicely pitched to where a lot of people are now, and sort of walking through. Part of the re-enchantment thing that's going on is scary for people. So today, Kale and Steve Skojek did a thing on the drones over New Jersey. I'm a little jealous. I leave New Jersey and the interesting things happen, and now I'm here in California. So I'm sure I could go back to Jersey if I wanted to, but I'm not. But, people... So we're in an age where there's a lot of anxiety. That's not going away. A lot more people are going to be anxious. But the anxiety with the enchantment and the re-enchantment, it's going to be interesting because it's also going to be bumping up into the meaning. And actually had some really good stuff on the meaning crisis on Twitter. So if you can find my Twitter, I retweeted from some stuff from a friend. Anyway, let's keep going.
Or Beethoven in a symphony. It's that energy, that shaping energy, which makes it what it is, but it's not a thing within it. And sadly, both religious people and not so religious people often think that religion is just believing there's one more thing in the universe than others think. Not that. Second thing, though, is that for me it's absolutely basic to understanding where I'm coming from as a believing person, to think that belief is an enhancement, an enlargement of what it is to be human, which is where not only...
Okay, and again, some of the stuff he's saying here is so subtle. Maybe he spent just way too much time around nice academics. I don't know. But a lot of what he's saying is really very important, but I think it's just going to go right over people's heads. And maybe he's just saying it for this audience, because this is obviously a very well-educated and sophisticated audience. But basically he's saying, number one, God is not just another thing in the universe. In him we live and move and have our being. That's sort of the God number oneness. But then also, religion is not basically religion is about making everything better and knowing everything better. And this, of course, is where a lot of good debate will happen, because the questions will be, well, does it? And then there'll be guys like T-Grog who say, hey, when I was a religious person, I was an angry person. I know someone that I grew up with who, how many details should I give? Not a lot. But he became a minister, became a really outspoken conservative minister in the CRC. There was a secret in his life, a pretty devastated one. When it came out, he left it, and he left the faith to a degree. I'd love to talk to him again. I don't know if he'd be willing to talk to me. I doubt he'd be willing to talk to me on YouTube. But I'd like to talk to him at some point, because, I mean, his life completely blew up. And I did chat with him a little bit after that, and he said, I was such an angry person. And this is part of the difficulty, of course, that the Tom Holland effect and the complete smuggling code that Jesus has done, so that while someone might be able to show a clear line of demarcation, if you talk to Chad the alcoholic and you talk to him about his life before sobriety and then Christianity and his life now, he'll say it's been a huge improvement. But if you talk to people who, let's say, perhaps grew up in it or went into it at some point and went into a corner, or for whatever reason the dynamics became legalistic and angry and self-righteousness and self-righteous, and that for them religion produced a reciprocal narrowing, and so they deconstruct and they get out, and of course some of them are zealots about it, and it's like, okay, we get it. You were a jerk as a Christian and you decided to give it up, and you're not as much of a jerk anymore. Or maybe you're just a jerk in a different way. Maybe it's some of the jerkiness you should give up on. So
the hope and the discipline that I try to live in makes sense, but also gives shape and purpose to how I look at the world around me, both the human and the non-human world.
in other words, he likes it and he ain't giving it up.
To see what it is that can be done here and now by me to enrich the life of what's around me, to help the life that's around me.
And he wants to, and because of it, he wants to help other people live better lives too.
Me become itself more life-giving, which is the ethical responsibility that I have as a believer, and the responsibility I have also to the whole of...
So not only is it a hobby, it's a duty, and it's something that's arranging my whole life.
the created order. So that's where I'd start, I think.
Oh, great. Philip, let's go over to you next. What's the best explanation for why we're here, and what's the purpose of us being here?
Right. Well, I think many in the West feel they face a choice. Either you have to believe in the very traditional idea of God as all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good, or you're a secular atheist, right? It's like, whose side are you on, Richard Dawkins or the Pope? Make your mind up, quickly. And I've come to think that actually both sides of this never-ending debate have something right and something wrong. Right? Traditional believers struggle to explain the horrible suffering we find in the world.
I don't know that traditional believers struggle to explain the horrible suffering. Traditional, again, I think Alvin Plantinga's point at the end of his little book, God, Freedom, and Evil, he basically says, look, the problem of evil is not really a philosophical problem. It's a pastoral problem. Tim Keller begins his book on suffering in the same way, and I think he's right. I don't know that people deal with this as an abstract question. I'm already beginning to echo what Elizabeth Oldfield is going to say. But what's really interesting about Philip Goff is... I would just let it play. It's funny.
Why would an all-powerful, loving God choose to create us through the horrific process of evolution by natural selection?
Okay, so again, everything is sort of shifted away from, okay, focusing God number 2. What about God number 1? And can God number 1 be trusted? Is God number 1 a good guy? Is it fruitful? Because basically, if he's not trustworthy and if he's not a good guy, then there's no point in reaching out to him.
But there are also things atheism struggles to explain. For example, the fine-tuning of physics for life, the surprising discovery of recent decades that for life to be possible, many numbers in physics had to fall in a certain very narrow range in such a way that it's incredibly improbable that our universe would have got the right numbers by chance. So we're in this situation where the believers are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering, the atheists are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning, when in fact there are middle ground options that can elegantly account for both of these data points. Consider, for example, the hypothesis of a God of limited power. A God who's made the best universe they can. Maybe God simply can't create complex life in an instant. Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right physics that is eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I'm sorry, I know it's going to be messy. This is all I can do. Is this or nothing?
Now, again, once God number 1 is sort of back on the table, certain ancient answers to perennial questions come up again. And that's pretty much what we see from Philip Goff and Alex O'Connor here. Alex O'Connor, even though he repeatedly says, I'm not a Gnostic, keeps sort of putting forth Gnostic ideas as answers to these problems. Now, in some ways, Philip Goff's answer is sort of like some kinds of Gnostic answers, that a lesser God made the world and he struggled, but then, and Rowan Williams later on is really going to pretty handily address the Gnostic challenges. But
I think this hypothesis can account for both the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations.
And it's not terribly good news, though. I mean, he might be happy that he thinks he's found an answer. He doesn't really seem to convince anybody else in the panel. But he's like, oh, I found an answer to this. Isn't this neat? It was kind of a dim God that made the universe, so...
I really believe this is where the evidence is pointing, and I suspect it's biases on both sides that are stopping us seeing that. Now, finally, you might think this doesn't seem to fit with the religions that have traditionally dominated the West. Well, I've come to think that this God of limited powers hypothesis fits quite well with a certain slightly heretical version of Christianity. A version of Christianity where God isn't interested in finding someone to punish for our sins. Rather, God is focused on unifying herself with the universe, bringing God and the universe into a state of deep, intimate unity. I've recently argued that this form of Christianity fits with modern science and liberal values and can make good sense of the meaning and purpose of our lives. So I'm someone who for 30 years thought Christianity was a load of bollocks. And But sometimes when you look at the same thing from a slightly different perspective, it could start to make a lot more sense. And that's what I found recently with this slightly unusual form of Christianity.
What are you doing? You're supposed to be atheists. Christians?
This has all happened since you invited me, sorry. Sorry.
Not fair enough.
Letting down the atheist side.
Don't worry, I haven't become an atheist.
Jack Symes is his name. Ortho Bros, he's all yours. The hotter orthodoxy gets, the weirder it's getting.
That would have balanced out, actually.
Big news, Archbishop.
Big news.
Okay, Alex, as our one atheist on the panel.
I've got some bad news. Or good news, if you like. No, unfortunately, I'm still an atheist. And I say unfortunately, not just for the sake of this little joke, but also because I'd quite like to believe in God. Sounds quite nice. I do think that Philip is right to say that there are sort of mysteries on both sides that can't be explained. For example, the existence of suffering. But let's not brush over that. We talk about it as if it's some kind of intellectual exercise. If we're confronted with two hypotheses, I think one good way to analyze them is to ask what we would expect under either hypothesis, and then compare it to what we do actually find. So what do we find? Well, a universe. That's pretty difficult to explain, especially because it's so finely tuned. One question is to ask why the sort of meta conditions of the universe are such that the constants have to be so finely tuned, why it is that they would have to be on a knife edge. It's almost as though God didn't want us to exist, and it's the time.
Now, again, it's really interesting because the fine-tuning argument sort of leans back, and Stephen Meyer writes the foreword to Spencer's book, and Spencer leans on Stephen Meyer in some ways. And again, just because there's intelligent design doesn't mean that everybody's going to be happy with the designer. So right now, one thing put on the table was, well, the designer wasn't really up to the task. Part of what's difficult about that answer is, how do we stack up against the designer even of this world that we have complaints about? Because we've continued to plumb its depths, and we don't seem to be able to get to the bottom of it. So, and then Alex O'Connor, the fine-tuning argument is interesting in that, well, it's sort of, again, either lead, if you're going to go to randomness, then suddenly you need like this multiverse where there's all of this. Again, you're trying to get rid of intentionality. And the reason you're trying to get rid of intentionality is because you've got anxieties about the intender, either the intender's competency or the intender's disposition towards you, or the intender's morality. And so actually a lot of these conversations are sort of swirling around those ideas. But part of what's behind this idea is that it's sort of the assumption that, well, existence should be simple. Existence should stand on its own. And while now we see through cognitive science and through all of the dynamics that more and more people are pointing out, we're recognizing, number one, that the universe is actually, the existence is actually far more complex than we thought. That actually, in our own enormous complexity, we simplify it. And so, in some ways, sort of the presumed simplicity that we wish to project, and then the complaint about the need to fine-tune, is a little ironic, because we've had new atheists basically saying, oh, that God idea about the universe that was way too simple. Now there's Carl Sagan, billions and billions, and the cells are so intricate, and so the more the intricacy and the short time frame and all of these things are leading now again towards complexity and intentionality of a creator. But now we're like, but why did the creator make it so complicated? Well, actually, until very recently, we all thought it was pretty simple. And as our knowledge of ourselves and the world we are in continues to grow, again, so suddenly God number one is back on the table. We see intentionality around us. And we're complaining about the level of sophistication. It's kind of a funny tack to take.
Tiniest little probability. There's an interesting argument to say that if you wanted to imagine that there was somebody who invented some kind of game where you were pulling balls out of a hat, and you were trying to figure out what color ball this creator of the game preferred, and you pulled out a yellow ball. That might be good evidence that the creator of this game likes yellow balls, fine. But if you then looked inside of the hat and found that every single other possible ball was purple, you might think, actually, it seems...
This is basically an argument about sample, and he also has sort of snuck in the blind elephant conundrum, where when you say a group of men, blind men discovering an elephant, everyone you've told the story to already has a whole elephant in mind. And I mean, part of the point is, and I think part of the point that should be made is that each of us, the monarchical vision is going away. Each of us has a perspective from which we approach the universe. Because we are limited, that perspective is going to have a sample bias. And how could it? Because if we're only going to live 80 or 100 years, if that, we're only going to have a certain amount of time to, in fact, sample the universe, and all of the ways that we are trying to sample it will never be able to finally exhaust the enormous complexity of the universe. And that enormous complexity is in many ways supported by the realization of the fine-tuning that has happened.
Seems like the creator of this game actually wanted the purple ball, and we happen to somehow get the yellow one. So there are lots of interesting heretical forms of Christianity that I do think account for this, such as the Gnostic tradition. The Gnostics, of course, believed that the universe, the material universe, was created by an evil demiurge. And that's the God of the Old Testament. Marcion, the man who compiled the first ever canon of the Bible, the first one, omitted the entire Old Testament because he thought that God was simply incompatible with the person and character of Jesus. So what did the Gnostics believe? They believed that there was some kind of higher creative God, sure, but that there was an evil demiurge creator God who created the universe. Well, what might that look like? Maybe the great power who sets the meta conditions tries to make it as...
I'll just jump to it. A little bit later, Rowan Williams, who of course has studied all of these things, basically says, okay, I understand the higher God and the lower God. What does it say about the higher God if he's being basically negligent watching the lower God? So in other words, this doesn't really get you out of the conundrum.
Difficult as humanly or inhumanly possible to create a universe. And yet, it's created anyway. That seems to be more in accordance, in my estimation, with a Gnostic theology of Christianity than with a traditional one.
So God number one is back, and now basically we're saying, is God available? Is God competent? Is God moral?
The fine-tuning argument might work, but I think it works perhaps against the favor of the Christians on the panel. If we look at what we do find in the universe outside of, or I should say inside of the universe itself, what else do we find? A system of natural selection that Philip just mentioned, which does not just involve, but relies upon the death and destruction of the unborn.
Now, it's interesting because so now God number one is back on the menu. now basically you're saying, okay, the universe has intentionality behind it. There is a creator behind it. We're going to keep skeptical. Nathan Jacobs on his channel said, the hiddenness of God is really where the arguments are right now. And I think Nathan Jacobs is exactly right with that. But, okay, where are we at then if, in fact, well, I find it difficult to believe Christian propaganda or delusion about the goodness of God and the accessibility of God. And what I really believe is that God is either incompetent or immoral. Where does that leave you? Now, it might leave your Sunday mornings free. But in terms of any of the bigger answers, or any sort of applicable rational religion. What do I mean by religion? If you've been listening to my rough drafts, religion is basically, the most basic level of religion is that which we use to sort of figure out what is best and how to pursue it. That's really what religion is. So now we've learned that the designer on top is incompetent or immoral or negligent or some degree of that. We're left to our own devices. In some ways, we're sort of even in a worse shape than paganism was before Christianity. Because, again, go all the way back. You can look at Ezekiel Kaufman's thesis that the real division in the universe is between the meta-divine realm, in which there are spirits and gods and all sorts of things above us, which are sort of controlling our lives, and we little humans have to suck up or manipulate. And again, just read Homer. It's all there, and it doesn't mean that miracles aren't possible. No, but you're looking for people and systems that have the answer to get to more powerful forms of knowledge in order to get out of this world what you want. If there's no morality at the top, then any pretense of morality below is just manipulation and trying to get what I want. And we're just going to be stuck at the whim of our own desires. And, okay, now compare that world to Rowan Williams' World of Love. And now suddenly we're sort of in the grip of Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson, because I would argue that you'd rather live in the United States of America than Somalia. Now, if you're a warlord in Somalia, pretty good. I was watching this. I should probably go back to it and finish it. I was watching this series on Showtime called Tyrant, and it was out a few years ago. It was basically about an American doctor who actually grew up the son of a tyrant in the Middle East, and he left all that to go to America, but then he gets sucked back into it, and his brother is now the tyrant, and they're just sort of going through all of these things. Well, if the creator of the universe is incompetent, negligent, out of touch, doesn't care, then you're just sort of left up to, well, I've got, hopefully, I love the answer that Eric Weinstein gave once to this question about God. He said, the problem with, basically, I'll rephrase it, the problem with a personal God is once there's a personal God, you got to worry what he thinks about you. Because that's true. I got a little pushback on some of my stuff on my Sunday sermon because I was dismissive of Noah's flood as kill all the evil people and only save the one best family in the world, and carrots and sticks, which is law and accountability. I'm glad America has prisons. I'm glad there's accountability. I'm not saying that accountability is wrong, and I'm not saying that, moving evil people out. I mean, God certainly does it a lot in the Old Testament. Moving evil people out is never has any utility. What I am saying is it doesn't actually have any capacity to do the kinds of changing to create, I think, a lot of what we've enjoyed in Christendom. I mean, Jordan Peterson's whole argument, his whole shtick is, whatever you believe about his application, his whole shtick is that Western society is one of the best societies the world has ever seen. So maybe we shouldn't be so slow as to throw it away. And a lot of those things that we like out of it are, what Philip Goff points to, liberal values. And so I don't know how these arguments really get us any place better. So, all right, so now there's intentionality in the universe, maybe, but I'm still not convinced that God is available, God is reliable, God is competent, God is good. Oh, and then in some ways you're really worse off. Before you just had chaos. Now, the ladder doesn't really go anywhere.
Fit. It actually exactly reverses our ethical intuitions that the weakest and the most vulnerable are people we should care about. Natural selection does the opposite. The weak suffer what they must, and the strong survive. Survival of the fittest.
And of course, the skepticism that Darwinism and social Darwinism produced in the early 20th century led to things that today probably everyone on this panel would decry: eugenics. Well, survival of the fittest seems to be the way it is. Just look at really what the Nazis did. I mean, people just sort of use Nazis as this stand-in for evil now, but just read what Nazis believed. They believed that survival of the fittest is the way to keep all of the elk healthy. Let the wolves kill the weak. And when it comes to humanity, be a wolf. Kill the weak.
Fittest is the same thing as the death and destruction of the unfit. And I'm told that this is the mechanism that God chose to embed into the universe, making a lot of animals, by the way, obligate carnivores. Why would he do that? So that they have to maul each other to death. When a lion eats a zebra, usually the zebra is too big to be killed instantly, so it suffers for minutes in writhing agony whilst its windpipe is...
And so then you sort of sit across the stage and say, well, all right, you win, Alex. Can I take you? How much money you got? What do you got in your pocket? What kind of evil games can I play to get out of you whatever my evil, dark little heart desires? Is this really the argument you want to make? No. I want all of the Christian values while continuing to make sure there aren't any Christian underpinnings, because I want morality to be basically Christian morality. And again, this is back where Tom Holland was, because Tom Holland began to look around and saying, if nobody actually believes in the wooey stuff, I'm not sure they're going to do the needed sacrificial little things to keep the world going. And in fact, a lot of people are looking and saying, well, I don't know if all that sacrifice for kids is worth it. I'll end the world with me. Oh, okay. Thanks.
Is caught in the jaws of a lion. I'm told that this is compatible with an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. Sure, it might be. I can't say it's impossible, but I ask you to think what's more likely. If you assume that there is an omnibenevolent invigilator, I don't think we would predict this. But on the hypothesis of naturalism, not only do we explain this phenomenon, we also come to expect it. So I think it offers a better account for at least this aspect of what we see in the world. And
part of what we've also been seeing is that, when we talk to Peugeot about sort of Hiroshima and Auschwitz, these sort of became the sacred touchstones for a generation. Now that those are going away, these are arguments basically that we saw in the 20s and 30s. And, nobody disproved eugenics. We practice eugenics all the time with dairy cows, with dogs, with, livestock we're hoping to maintain. We're always practicing eugenics. And people are increasingly nudging towards it. And it's only those darn Christians that seem to say, I'm not so sure.
Tuning consideration is a difficult one, but ask yourself just intuitively, if in, say, 80 years from now, you were watching somebody looking at an old screening of this recording. They're watching it in 80 years, and one of them says, gosh, can you believe it? They haven't worked out the fine-tuning yet. That seems plausible. But can you conversely imagine them watching it and going, gosh, can you believe it? They hadn't worked out the problem of evil yet. They hadn't explained why suffering exists.
And this is where I think it sort of nicely sets up Elizabeth, because tell me about explanations. Because, you know, let's say, heaven forbid, I develop cancer, and it's a painful form of cancer, and I'm suffering in pain as cancer. And let's say the state of California comes around and says, well, you don't need to suffer. We'll give you some pills and you can end your life right now. We'll set the date and we'll put it on the calendar and off you go. Well, at least as a Christian, I think, well, at least I have a hope of going anywhere. But also as a Christian, I think, no, I'm not going to do that. I am going to suffer with my cancer. And again, I know, you know, a bunch of people in the TLC, that Jordan Peterson. Okay. But Jordan Peterson is at least addressing these kinds of questions, because do I really need an explanation of why I'm writhing in pain because of the cancer? A doctor can say, oh, okay. Doctor, explain my pain to me. The doctor would say, oh, I can easily explain your pain to you. You have cancer. Oh. There's the explanation. What we're looking for is meaning. And then the question is, well, why should you stay alive? Oh. Can I live in pain with meaning? And all the way back to the beginning of the Jordan Peterson stuff. That's been the question. Because meaning is actually what we use for suffering. Meaning is in many ways the answer to suffering. And Christianity, of course, puts at the center, within the story of Christianity, someone who need not suffer. Tim Keller is a great place to get quotes from. Believe it or not, Albert Camus understood that. In his amazing piece of writing, Camus says almost these exact words: Christ the God-man suffers too. Evil and death can no longer be entirely imputed to him, since he suffers and dies. The night on Golgotha is so important because the divinity ostensibly abandoned its traditional privilege and lived through to the end, despair included, the agony of death. So let's get Elizabeth in there.
It just seems to me more intuitively plausible that one of those problems is a problem that will be solved and one is not. But as I say, that's just a hunch.
Let's bring in Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I had the pleasure of reading your book over the last weekend. It seemed a lot more down to earth than the philosophy texts that I'm used to. So maybe your emphasis might be on the latter part of the question, like the purpose of why we're here, how we can craft our lives, rather than these speculations about the origin of the universe.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the origin of the universe. I wasn't there, so I don't feel qualified. And I don't find it that interesting. And so I started to ask myself,
I think
why?
you've got the wrong crowd for that question.
Or rather, I'm interested in why we do find it interesting. What is it about the origin of things that fascinates us? It's usually because we want to learn something about where we are now, right? We think it will tell us something about where we've landed now. I think fundamentally underneath, it's an identity question. It's closer to the yearning of an adoptive child to know where they came from. Who am I is what's going on when we ask about our origins. Do I matter? Am I?
And again, okay, who am I? An adoptive child. Okay, you're the son and daughter of these two human beings. That's not really what they're asking. Again, it's sort of like the suffering question. Who am I? What's the meaning of my relationship with these two people?
Are we in this theatre tonight just the random meat shrapnel spun out from a set of accidental processes? Or were we meant? Wanted?
See, and, well, let's let her finish.
Am I ultimately loved is what I think the big one is.
And so that's, again, sort of where the line is. It's the two people to the left of Jack that says, we are loved. wait a minute. I'm sorry. To his right and to his left, saying, one says, well, we're loved but Daddy's a little dim. And the other, Daddy's a little evil. And that's sort of where it goes. And which then makes, let's say, Christians want to increase their tribe. All right. What is involved for Christians increasing their tribe? It's basically people that are in love with the Creator and have reason to love and can hang on to that love. And can hang on to that love even when loving isn't easy or loving isn't obvious or loving doesn't seem to make sense today. In other words, it's not that different relationally from how many other different things. It's probably a good time to stop. Lord willing, there'll be another video. Let me know what you think.